Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I've got a full tank review for you on this bizarre looking beast. This is the Object Kust. It's a tier 8 Soviet tank destroyer in the game. Yeah, I know, another one. We've got a lot of Soviet tank destroyers, premium ones inside the game, so this one will have to be very different for it to justify any kind of your attention. And as you can see with the armor layout on this vehicle, yes, it's very different indeed. This has a 130mm main armament capable of doing 550 damage with a hydropneumatic suspension that can give it 10 degrees of gun depression, and it also has 110mm of upper hull armor, meaning this is pretty much an auto ricochet when angled correctly against all of its opponents. We just won't mention anything about what is possibly one of the worst weak points in the history of World of Tanks on top of this tank, but if you can manage to deal with that, boy, this thing is funky. And I'm going to show you why I think this vehicle is going to be not only a very capable tank in the hands of great players, but also probably quite a good tank in the hands of complete potatoes as well. So the first tricky thing is, what do you compare the Kust to? Well, the obvious candidate is another tier 8 tank destroyer with a hydropneumatic suspension that has a similar kind of frontal armor, the Stridsvagn S1. So immediately we notice that the 130mm on this tank hits far harder than the 105mm can on the Swedish vehicle. 550 is a whopping old shell. Also, this vehicle with 279mm of penetration looks like it's worse than the Stridsvagn S1, but that is only when you don't take into account that this vehicle is firing AP rounds with those 5 degrees of normalization, whereas the APCR rounds on the Stridsvagn S1 will only have 2 degrees of normalization. Also, the Kust has an advantage with regards to its gold rounds because they're heat up to 320, which will make them more flexible than the APCR rounds, with albeit 330mm of penetration on the gold on the Stridsvagn S1. So the Stridsvagn S1 will be better at shooting angled surfaces or spaced armor, but I'd rather have the heat for shooting at targets up to 85 degrees of angled armor. HE wise as well, the Kust absolutely demolishes with 700 alpha HE and 65mm of pen, which can be great for very weakly armored targets. The tragic thing about this tank is its damage per minute, 1,853. That would be average, if not poor, for a medium tank these days in World of Tanks. And the Stridsvagn S1 with its 2,300, I would consider that bad for a tier 8 tank destroyer. Accordingly, this thing has to spend nearly 18 seconds reloading without improving that rate of fire to do 550 alpha. That's nearly the same reload as an ISU 152K, but that's hitting for 750. That's how bad the damage per minute is on the Kust. Luckily, the shell velocity, not bad for a Soviet tank at 1,150, means this is pretty okay for sniping. Not nearly as good as the Swede, but pretty okay. It also carries more than enough ammunition to take a variety of rounds that you're practically never going to run out of unless you're missing all of your shells. So, the Kust has a siege mode, a hydropneumatic suspension, a lot like the Stridsvagn S1. And we can see that you get Stridsvagn level benefit from entering that siege mode with regards to your gun handling. The base aim time in the travel mode of the Kust is 3 seconds with 0.43 accuracy, horrible dispersion when moving, and also importantly when you're turning the tank and also when you're turning the turret, which is interesting because you can only kind of turn it up and down. This is brutal because the Stridsvagn S1, when it's out of the siege mode, only has bad dispersion values when it's moving forwards and backwards, not actually when it's turning the tank. So the Kust, you pretty much have to be in the siege mode to be not having the most big reticle, and you'll actually save time by going into the siege mode for those 2 seconds and then aiming to be able to deliver that shot accurately. Luckily, when you do go into the siege mode, the aim time goes to 1.7, which is really nice, 0.33 accuracy, which is lovely for 130mm, and the dispersion values when moving and turning the hull become much more manageable at 0.12. However, I'd like to clarify the Stridsvagn S1 has perfect dispersion when turning left and right, unlike the Kust, so you will actually have to spend some time aiming if you move to the left and the right, as I'm going to be showing you in the gameplay. So this vehicle naturally has 5 degrees of gun depression. So even if you're outside the hydropneumatic suspension, you'll be able to depress the gun by 5 degrees. And you also have a little bit of wiggle room, at least according to Tanks GG, with regards to how the gun can turn to the left and the right. However, the real kicker on this tank is that it has a fully free gun to elevate as much as it wants. So if you end up in an awkward situation where you need to bomb it down a slope at full speed while taking a chancy shot at something on the other side, you could make it work. However, the real kicker is when you enter into the siege mode in this tank. When you enter into the siege mode, now you can then use the hydropneumatic suspension to tilt your vehicle down an extra 5 degrees, giving this thing 10 degrees of gun depression, which is very nice. Mobility-wise, this vehicle's pretty fast outside the siege mode with 50 forwards, with 20 backwards, although that's not nearly as good as the Stridsvagn S1's 45 backwards. But as soon as you go into the siege mode, you are going to need a turbo. You can go at 5 forwards, 5 backwards. It is horrendous. And the Stridsvagn S1 with its 8 forwards and 8 backwards feels like a completely different class of tank. Luckily, this thing has a good power to weight ratio of 18, but its ground resistances are worse than the Swede, meaning that these two tanks, they have fairly comparable mobility, but I'd say the Stridsvagn S1 is probably faster all in all. However, considering how comparable these tanks are with regards to their gun handling, their mobility, and their firepower, what is incomparable with these two tanks is the armor. The Kust has 110 millimeters at the front and 40 on the side, whereas the Stridsvagn S1 has 30 at the front and 30 at the side. That means the Stridsvagn S1 will be overmatched by all 91 millimeter caliber guns, whereas the Kust is going to be able to only get overmatched by 121 millimeter caliber guns on the side of the vehicle, and nothing's overmatching the front with 110. It's also got 200 more hit points than the Stridsvagn S1, meaning that it is definitely a class above with regards to its durability. How this thing's armor works, let's imagine you're getting shot by a Kust without using any of your gun depression outside the siege mode. Now, yeah, your armor doesn't look great, but it's still about 250 millimeters of effective armor. So if we were to say get shot by, I don't know, a medium tank like an AAT-60 instead, you'll see that this thing's armor, it's pretty good, especially against APCR rounds. And it's only your lower plate that's tragic. But if you do angle it, the lower plate on this tank, it's not even that bad, and you will be able to pull off some miracle bounces, and you will be able to bait noobs into shooting your lower plate as you come around the corner like this. However, are you all seeing the obvious issue with this tank? And that is the worst weak point probably on any vehicle. This thing, it puts even the 59 pattern to shame, let's be honest. And it's only 30 millimeters thick, meaning that even medium tanks can penetrate it with HE rounds. Yeah. This means that if you do come over the ridgeline slowly in the Kust, your opponents are going to have had more than enough time to shoot a very large object which is snipeable even from long ranges before you've even managed to see their gun. So an absolute nightmare there for the Kust. But still, compared to an S1, this thing has some serious armor. But then again, an S1 against 90mm caliber guns and lower, they literally just can't pen you from the front if you're pointing your gun at them, whereas everybody can pen the Kust. To add to this, the Kust has horrible view range of 350, a lot like the S1, but its camo rating completely sucks compared to the Stridsvagn S1. However, it's still not horrendous. At 10, it's pretty much the same as many medium tanks like a Leopard prototype. Crew-wise, the Kust has 4 crew members where the commander is also operating as the radio operator. The crew skills that I would recommend for the Kust will be Brothers-in-Arms, Repairs, Concealment, Recon, and Coordination Emergency. For your commander, for your radio operator skills, I would take Situational Awareness, Firefighting, and Jamming on this tank. For your gunner skills, I would recommend Brothers-in-Arms, Repairs, Concealment, Deadeye, Armorer, and Concentration. And the reason why I recommend Concentration on this tank is inside the siege mode, as long as you don't go forwards or backwards, you can turn left and right as much as you want, and Concentration will still stay active, giving you that 3.5% accuracy boost until you need to go forwards or backwards. If you really didn't care about the combat capacity of this tank with regards to chasing your opponents down, you could even drop Repairs and take Designated Target on this tank if you want to play only at long range. Driver-wise, you must take Engineer. It's the most important skill on this tank. Brothers, Repairs, Concealment, Off-Road, Driving, and Clutch Braking will do you wonders on this tank, but Smooth Ride can help out as well if you want to drop one of those. For a load, I'd recommend Brothers, Repairs, Concealment, definitely Intuition to make use of the AP and the Heat rounds, which are two completely different flavors of ammunition for 2 completely different jobs. And then I'd personally like Ammo Tuning and Perfect Charge on this tank because it's got such horrible damage per minute. You're never really going to be in close quarters combat. Adrenaline Rush, you're hardly ever going to be on low hit points because the vehicle doesn't have any. Safe Stowage, I'd rather have the sniping capacity on this tank. Equipment wise on this tank, I've got 2 builds. The first one is going to be vents with coated optics and an experimental turbo. Now, I know a lot of you are saying, well, this is a tank destroyer. Why aren't you going to be using a gun rammer on it? All right, save that for my second build, okay? For my first build, this is for when I want to snipe at long range, when I want to actually have some view range. Let me clarify. Even with recon, situational awareness, a premium consumable, vents, and coated optics, I only get 454 meters view range. Now, you could get around this by taking binoculars instead, which would work well on this tank because they'll still be active as long as you don't go forwards and backwards. You could turn as much as you want, but I feel that having that flexibility for coated optics so you don't have to sit still for 3 seconds, it's transformative for how you can play. Now, the experimental turbo on this tank, I think it's a very solid pick. This will allow you to go forwards 4 kilometers an hour faster, nearly doubling your top speed inside the siege mode. It will also allow you to fall back 2 to 3 kilometers an hour faster as well, which will add 20 to 30% to your reverse speed. Once you combine this with engineering, you're able to go forwards at 10 kilometers an hour. Now, the better the turbo you can get on this tank, the better your performance will be. Bounty turbo will be better than level 1 experimental, but not as good as level 3 experimental. And Bond, I'd say, would be better than level 3 experimental on this tank, purely from the extra speed forwards and backwards. However, as I showed you, even in the siege mode, this vehicle doesn't have the best of dispersion values, and so the experimental turbo, it works wonders on this tank, but would be terrible for you to put on a Swedish tank destroyer. So my second build is going to be, I'm going in and I've got to be aggressive. You know, those Runebergs, your Himmelsdorfs, or even maps where you just want to take the fight to the enemy team. Then I'm going to be using gun rammer, I'm going to be using durability, and I'm going to be using an experimental turbo on that build. Let me clarify, on my Swedish tank destroyers, I always take a gun rammer, but because this vehicle has such bad damage per minute and reasonably good alpha damage, you get to hide for so long in between your shots that a gun rammer provides precious little value compared to vents. Field mods wise on this tank, you must take reinforced suspension because this will also improve how mobile your vehicle is. Next up, improve the accuracy, follow it up with some view range. And for this slot, I'd probably recommend the scouting all in all and have a little bit of extra view range. But if you find yourself wanting to use the durability build instead, then by all means go for that. But you know what? I think that's quite enough theory crafting. Let's see how the Kust performs on the battlefield. So first up, I'm going to be rolling out in the Kust on Overlord. And this is against some tier 9 tanks, some tier 8 tanks, so fairly balanced matchmaking. Although really, this tank doesn't give a monkey's what it's shooting at. It reliably gets the job done. This kind of pen, it's the standard pen on a Grilla, for example. So when you're shooting this at tier 6s, almost feels like cheating within that regard. Although, you know, 279 is not perfect, right? It's not like you've got 300 standard pen like you'll have on a tier 10 tank destroyer, at least most of the tier 10 tank destroyers. So what I want to highlight here right off the get-go is a couple of things about this tank. One, a hydropneumatic suspension you can see. And you can also see that concentration, right in the middle of the bottom of your screen there, is always active, even when I'm turning to the left and to the right. However, I also want to highlight, do you see how much this one blooms out compared to a Stridsvagn? So if you're used to the Swedish tank destroyers where you can turn left and right and you've got absolutely no dispersion when you're turning the tank, then you're going to be disappointed with the Kust. You're going to have some issues, you really are. The Kust does bloom out a lot when you turn to the left and when you turn to the right. And this is why I'm saying that the experimental turbo might be pretty good on this tank. Remember that smooth ride doesn't help you your hull traverse dispersion. It only helps your moving forwards and backwards dispersion. So keep that in mind, that smooth ride isn't a way for you to be able to improve that. The only way that you could improve that is with a rotation device, or in this case, an experimental turbo. So here you can see we can fire, and without even leaving the siege mode, just roll back at 10 kilometers an hour. A lot of noobs will buy this tank, or they'll gamble in loot boxes and get it and take it out onto the battlefield, and they just won't take a turbo. Not taking a turbo... let me just clarify this, that the most important piece of equipment on any of your low top speed hydropneumatic tanks, like your Swedish tank destroyers, your tier 8, your tier 9, your tier 10, and this vehicle now as well, the most important piece of equipment is the turbo. If I could take multiple turbos on this tank, I probably would, because then I could go at 15 forwards and backwards, and I'd be a lot more flexible in this tank. And if I could take multiple turbos on a Stridsvagn S1, or should I say a Stridsvagn 103B, I could be driving around at like 22, 23 kilometers an hour if I took multiple Bond turbos on. That would be absolutely savage. So please, 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 if there's one thing you take away from this review today, it is that the turbo is mandatory on this tank because of the flat bonus that it provides inside that siege mode. A turbo really shouldn't give its full bonus inside the siege mode. I don't know why Wargaming did it, because how does it make sense that a tank that's limited to 5, if you were to put a bond turbo on this, would go at 11? Whereas if you put a bond turbo at something that goes 60, it can now go 66, right? And you're literally increasing your top speed limit by 100%, or more than 100%, if you were to put a bond turbo on this tank. And if you were to put a level 3 experimental turbo, it's 100% speed increase inside that siege mode. And then your driver must have engineer, because then that will add another 1 kilometer an hour as well. So even with the regular equipment that you see me using here, and I didn't upgrade the experimental because I want my tank reviews to be based on, should we say, not min-maxing the tank. And your results will be better if you put bond or you put bounty equipment on this tank than the standard equipment that I use. But this thing min-maxed, you could end up going, let's think it's going to be 5 plus 6 plus 1, it's going to be 12. You could go at 12 kilometers an hour forwards in this vehicle with a bond turbo and with engineer, and that would be a very hugely powerful advantage over going at 5. So this vehicle, in all of the games that I played it, guys, it's not a flashy tank. It's a dirty tank. It's a dirty Soviet scoundrel of a vehicle. This gun just absolutely slaps. With the perfect charge ability to be able to increase the shell velocity by about 13% with the premium consumable and the vents on this thing, it's now got pretty good shell velocity. Not bad at all, if I can show it. 1,303. That's a huge upgrade over the 1,150 base. Now it feels like it's a sniper. And the accuracy on this tank of 0.33, once you get concentration on it, you've got your vents, you've improved it with the field mod, it gets pretty good. And to have that 550 alpha damage, this thing's mean. The only thing that sucks about it is that weak point on top. If the vehicle didn't have that weak point on top, this thing would be one of the most broken tanks that Wargaming has ever released. Because it's kind of like a Stridsvagn S1 that also has the gun depression advantage. Now, I'm not sure if that was blind or if I was spotted. But you know what? I'm going to hit you harder than you hit me, mate. So, no hard feelings. I could have still been spotted by maybe the tank that caught a glimpse at me in the east if they had a designated target as well. But maybe the A phase one just put a chunk into me. I have to admit, having this vehicle's hit points, the extra 200 that you have over the S1, it definitely does make you feel like you've got a different class of durability. Just 200 hit points extra makes all of the difference. It's kind of the difference between you getting one shot by a Jagdpanzer 100 and you not, or you being able to take 3 shells from like a 105mm gun with 390 alpha damage at least half of the time and not. It really does make a big difference. And I found that this tank, unlike an S1 that can only really use its armor when it's playing against tier 6 or tier 7 tanks or miraculous players who don't have access to heat and don't have more than 90mm guns in caliber to be able to make use of the overmatch, I found that this thing, its armor was pretty useful. Maybe not so much in the game that you see me playing now, but definitely in some of the later games that I'm going to be showing you today. You'll see that it's not perfect armor, but it's useful. Obviously having that huge weak point, awful. Lower plate on this tank, awful. Side armor on this tank, pretty much overmatchable. Excuse me, I'm not going to mute, otherwise I'll probably cry later on this evening. I digress. That 40mm of side armor, it can still allow you to drive at most tanks and be able to get away with it. But if you're thinking that this is like a flashy tank that's going to be just firing multiple shells at its opponents in quick succession, it's not. And that's why I'm thinking that this vehicle could be quite good in the hands of a casual player. I'm not suggesting that a casual player will always make the right decision about should they be using the siege mode, should they not be using the siege mode. Will the casual player watch my video and actually take, in my opinion, the correct equipment on this tank to be more useful? That's a different thing altogether. I honestly have no idea how that one missed. Rewind the YouTube video and slow it down. That one looked like it went... It might have actually found a gap in the guy's center hull there. Bizarre. Or maybe I hit the gun and it somehow absorbed. Either or, I'm pretty irritated that I didn't get to punish that SVAC for getting caught out in the open. So this is the stage of the game where the Kust can just do things the other tank destroyers can only really dream of. We are going to slowly walk down our opponents. Now, I wish I just had a turret instead. You know, in an ideal world, I'll just have a turret. That guy hit my weak point. I hit his a lot harder, however. So we demolish a very similar tank in the form of the STRV-1030. We take a quick look to see, where did he hit me? Yeah, of course, he hit the absolute free real estate that is the top of this tank. But look at this thing's like gun handling, it's not bad. And once again, where did the SFAC shoot me? Yes, in my huge weak point. But the thing is that this thing's got 550 alpha, and if it just walks its opponents down with this tremendously accurate, high alpha damage, high penetration gun, it's brutal. It's like this inevitable creeping death that's coming towards you. And that guy whiffed because he wasn't using his gun depression correctly. And that's how quickly we turned our game around here. Now we're up to a very respectable 3,400 combined, and we destroyed a third of the enemy team. And this just consistently happened to me in my games when I was playing the Kust. It just seems to add up. It doesn't do flashy amounts of damage quickly. It's not an autoloader. It's nothing like that. But what this vehicle does is it just does things consistently. At least until I opened my mouth for the last shot, where I guess I was a little bit greedy and tried to get a top gun here. There is no doubt that this thing is an absolute freak of a tank on the battlefield. So, how should you play your Kust? Should you sit at the back of the map and just try to snipe things? Or should you just try and get forwards and try to spot things? Well, you're gonna have to find a happy medium, right? Sometimes it's better to sit back and snipe. Sometimes you can actually be a lot more cheeky in a tank like this, especially when you find yourself in a mid matchup where your armor actually means something rather than when you're getting absolutely pounded by tier 10 tanks. And so I decided to myself, let's get forwards. You know, they got a lot of tank destroyers. I don't feel like I'm going to out-snipe them, even though I'm a very proficient sniper. So what I want to do is I want to get forward, try and get on a ridgeline and try and harass my opponents. But then, I saw that there was a nightmare situation, and that is that there's a Char Future 4 in front of me. Okay, just got to defend myself intelligently and point my gun up to try and, like, make my weak point a little bit more awkward and try to tilt my vehicle up just to try and see if I can get the guy to bounce. And luckily, we actually ricochet a shell. Now, what that means is that if he doesn't high roll, he can't actually kill me with the 3 remaining shells. But now he only needs 330 to be able to get rid of me after 2 significant high rolls. But for some reason, the Char isn't trying to fight me. He's actually just taking it from my team. And it must have dawned on me, but maybe a little bit too late. Maybe he had already fired one of his shells somewhere at a different tank, maybe at the Type 62 in the middle. And luckily, we managed to get through that situation. But yeah, maybe a little bit of premonition from what I said earlier, that I should have had enough hit points to be able to handle 3 shells from a Char. More times out of 10 than I couldn't. Unfortunately, it looks like if the Char just high rolls for plus 50 and then plus 40, luckily we bounced the first shell, then we weren't going to do much good. One thing I'd like to highlight about this weak point on top of this vehicle is that if all you want to do is spot, you don't actually need to expose this much of your tank. Right now, my opponents can see my gun and see all above the gun as well, so they have all of this kind of area that they could be able to shoot. But with the camera rating being not so bad on this tank, you know, as long as you do have that full concealment crew, you can take your chances with getting up into positions like this. And a fallen tree is going to mean that I can spot my opponents when they fire and I can punish them. And this is where I like to have a tank like this. Swedish tank destroyers especially, I fit right in with the Kust because I've played hundreds, if not like 1,000 or more games in Swedish non-turreted tank destroyers. And I really love them. They're wonderful. They're such a fun vibe of gameplay, of having to work this awkward hydropneumatic suspension. And they actually do really well getting forwards and playing as if they're medium tanks without turrets. And so the way that I'm going to play my Kust, sometimes if I'm dealing with tier 10 tanks, or I just think the situation dictates it, I might play that long-range sniper role. But more often than not, when I play my Kust, I am going to go forwards, try and work a ridgeline, and try to be the bully. Because this is how not only you can have big games for yourself, it is also how you can have a big influence on the battle. If I hadn't gone forwards, maybe the Char would have extended vision and been able to spot all my TDs. But because I'm the one forwards, I'm the one here, I'm the one spotting out my opponents, I'm the one now getting the crossfire to be able to help out the Govika, or no, sorry, the Type 62 on our team, to be able to get the game flowing in our team's favor. And just like that, another tier 9 tank destroyer shut down, and I should have enough hit points to take a hit from the Leo here, so let's get forwards. So I'm going to make a, well, not a misplay now, but a misplay later on in this game. Just going to get up on this ridge, and again, you'll see that that reticle is huge when we're not in the siege mode, but when we are in the siege mode, it's not bad at all. This thing just claps, ladies and gents. It just claps. In the first 4 minutes and 20 seconds of this battle, we picked up 3 kills, and we are just shy of 5,000 combined. But I'm going to make a misplay here, and that is that I went into the siege mode, and I was like, what am I doing? So not only do I miss the opportunity to maybe get the Cheeto SP, I'm also going to miss the opportunity to be able to get the Leo here as well. But nevertheless, a great game for the Kust. We got forwards, we pressured the Char. We probably should have died in that situation, but we didn't. The vehicle's armor got me out of trouble a little bit, and that was enough pressure to be able to handle them. There's no way I would have survived that in an S1. If I was in an S1, the Char would have just shot me 3 times, overmatched me. I'm done. I'm out the game. Because of the ricochet that the Kust pulled off there, the Char couldn't manage to finish me off. And that's even with them getting lucky and high rolling. More than 50% of the time, the Char has to pen all 4 shells to get rid of this vehicle. And then probably about like 45% of the time, they have to pen 3 shells and just high roll. These are all big differences as to how you can play this tank. And bam, it's a fairly interesting vehicle to play from that regard. All right, so round 3 for the Kust. We're rolling out on Mura Vanka once again. We're going to take the fight down the west against the enemy team. This thing, so much opportunity on a map like this, right? We could go snipe in a location like this. We could go over into the woods, use our 10 degrees of gun depression. So much opportunity for a vehicle like this. Okay. Now, I'm not going to be featuring any gameplay from where I've used the gun rammer and the durability. You could go and watch my Twitch stream from yesterday if you want to see a little bit of that. The vehicle isn't really designed to kind of fight on those city maps, and I'd say that the tier 9 and the tier 10 Swedish tank destroyers are going to do better than this vehicle against the majority of opponents. In some ways, I'd rather play a Swedish tank destroyer because it's basically just like a yes or no with regards to whether they pen me. With this tank, it's more about, do they shoot my weak point or not for my lower plate, or do they manage to hit the weak point on top? Another thing I'd like to mention about this thing that's kind of really irritating is that if you want the vehicle to tilt itself backwards after it's fired, you have to do something really annoying because of the gun elevation. With a Swedish tank destroyer, once you've got past the UDES, all you have to do is zoom out and then aim up, and then the hydropneumatic suspension will tilt down. And what this means is that while it will make your lower plate a little bit more vulnerable, it will actually make your upper plate less exposed, and if it is exposed, it will dramatically improve its effectiveness. However, in this tank, what you'll see is that because of the fact that you have natural elevation, that the hydropneumatic suspension doesn't activate unless you look up in sniper mode. And so what you are going to have to do if you want to play the Kust min-max on a ridgeline like this is you'll have to do this. You'll have to aim up immediately inside the sniper mode, and what this will do is it will tilt your vehicle backwards, and while it will expose a little bit more of your lower plate, it's going to make that weak point a lot more hidden. And I have to admit, doing this, do you really want to do that? I'm not sure. In a perfect world, Wargaming would have a couple of extra key assignments where you could actually do that inside the siege mode and to choose how the vehicle plays out, and it wouldn't be about where you're pointing your gun. But I can see why Wargaming wouldn't want to do that. But it's one of the unobvious annoyances that you will have in this vehicle from having the luxury of a gun that isn't locked to the hull. I would actually far rather have a gun that isn't locked to the hull. And the reason for this is because Wargaming have changed the way that the siege mode works. Back in the day with the UDES, when you left the siege mode, it tilted the rear of the tank down. So if you were on a ridgeline with the UDES and you tilted your tank like that and then you tilted your gun up, when you left the siege mode, it tilted the back of the tank down before it lowered the gun. However, Wargaming changed the coding. I don't know why, but they've changed the coding, so now when you've got your rear exposed in the UDES and you have your gun pointing out, if you leave the siege mode, it just sits there, and then it leaves at the end, and then it starts to escape. So this was a massive nerf for the UDES, and it's also really annoying for the Kust that this is now an aspect of the game that you're going to have to deal with. So I'm aiming up here, and my shell must have deviated just a few pixels towards the left, and so the Ferdinand manages to ricochet that shell. A bit of an annoying round. I'd also like to highlight in this entire replay, or entire video today, I'm not sure I fired that many gold rounds. You really don't have to YOLO much gold. The only time I really remember firing a lot of gold in this tank in the hours that I managed to play it was when I was spamming gold at a Jagdpanzer 100. But ridgeline! Look at this armor starting to pull off now, right? 1,200 blocked, 1,600 blocked. This thing's armor works when they kind of just aim at the center of the tank and pray. If they miss that weak point or they just don't bother to aim at it, yeah, they're going to struggle. They're going to struggle a lot. But this thing, it's a solid tank. It's a really weird vehicle because it has sniping capabilities, but it also, outside of these just juggernaut moments where it's absolutely clapping with 550 alpha, it also has a lot of armor to be able to transition from being a pure sniper to where you actually just want to try and win the game. Nice shot there on the SU-101. Say hello to the garage for us, mate. No hard feelings. One Soviet Tier 8 tank destroyer to another Soviet Tier 8 tank destroyer. And in this kind of situation, I feel like the game, we just had so much more of an impact than a tank destroyer is meant to. Right? Blocking 50% more than the hit points of my vehicle, excluding the blind fire that we don't know how much it did. It's kind of like a 4,300 combined game, and there's still meat left on the table for us to consume. Sorry about that to Mr. Scorpion, but I want to try and get forwards. I want to try and get to the ridgeline. And so I would thoroughly recommend trying out a build like this. With a tank like this, with its high alpha and low damage per minute, I think a gun rammer is overrated on a tank like this. I'd try vents, coated optics, and a turbo. And the better the turbo, the better. I'd recommend, if you don't have an experimental turbo, take a regular turbo. Then I'd recommend experimental turbo, level 1. Then I'd recommend experimental turbo 2. Then I'd recommend bounty turbo. Then I'd recommend experimental turbo 3. And then I'd recommend to get the big boy Bond turbo. That would be my turbo tier list, so to say, for this vehicle. And that turbo tier list is pretty much for all of the vehicles that I'd be playing. But who can afford a Bond turbo on a tier 8 premium Soviet tank destroyer, right? So a little bit worried here that this Kampfpanzer is going to go through my weak point. And let me clarify, that weak point, it's only 30 millimeters of armor. And so, if that Kampfpanzer loaded HE, and they fired at the weak point, they would be able to get rid of it in a single shot. So, when you see these things flood the battlefield, starting from today, ladies and gents, boys and girls, shoot that blooming weak point on top of the tank, okay? Shoot the blooming weak point on top of the tank. And, with regards to other tanks that are going to be flooding the matchmaker, the WZ-111-6 will be flooding the matchmaker today. And so make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to get the notification for when my WZ-111-6 tank review is released tomorrow. So, all in all, the Kust. What do I think about it? I think it's a pretty solid tank, boys and girls. I'm not saying it's kind of like the new best tank destroyer that you can be able to get your hands on, but this is a very solid tank. A very solid vehicle. Maybe it's just because I'm used to the Swedish tank destroyers. And if you're used to the Swedish tank destroyers, you will do well in this tank, almost immediately right from the get-go. It'll take you maybe like 5, 10, 15, 20 games to learn some of the nuances. But if you've played the UDES, and you've managed to do well in your UDES, and you've also played your Tier 10 Swedish tank destroyer, your Tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer, you will know how to play this vehicle. And it's a good one. I'm actually thinking that this vehicle will do very, very well in the hands of great players, and I think it will also do well in the hands of terrible players. Because of how reliable that gun is inside the siege mode. So terrible players will just sit in a position and snipe, 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 snipe. And good players will realize that this thing has some armor, as we can see here, 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 and here. If it pressures its opponents, just not really care about the weak point on top of the tank and just to take the fight to the enemy team. And if you do that, you can have more than tank destroyer impact in your battles. And I think you'll do pretty well. So that game was 6,200 combined, a high caliber for our effort, and as we didn't fire any gold rounds, we make 100,000 credits profit. And if you don't end up spamming gold in this tank, and even the gold in this tank is only 4,800 credits, this is quite an economic tank to play. I think the only thing that I would say about this vehicle is, does anyone really want another tier 8 Soviet tank destroyer when you've probably already got the SU-130 PM, you've already got yourself your T-103, ISU-152K, as well as even a KV-4 KTTS? Do you really need another Soviet premium inside the game? Well, realistically, Wargaming totally need to have it. So that they can force you to have to buy more 50 lots of loot boxes to be able to get possibly the one that you want. And my big recommendation to all of you, ladies and gents, remember, if you don't have any of these tanks and you want to get the Kust, you could end up having to buy 400 boxes to be able to get it. Please don't gamble inside the game. I recommend that you wait until Wargaming, do the fair thing, and sell it outside of loot boxes for a fair price. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was it for today. Really hope you enjoyed this tank review. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know what you think about the Object Kust in the comments down below. Do you think it looks like an absolute banger, or do you think it looks absolutely terrible? Have you got premium fatigue right now? Are you going to bother getting your hands on it? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.